If you watch a James Bond film, there's often an evil scientist intent on destroying the world. Well, this video is going to be about scientists who are definitely not evil, but in my opinion, they're starting to get pretty dangerous, and at least if you're a coral reef. This is about scientists who want to transplant corals from the Indo-Pacific region, that's around Australia, Indonesia, over into the Caribbean, supposedly because all the corals in the Caribbean are in terrible trouble. And it's a very risky, silly thing to do. Now, they're going on about how the Caribbean reefs are particularly devastated by climate change and the terrible decline in corals over there. So that's why they've got to transplant these corals. Now, I learned this story from a Reef Rebels viewer called Oliver, an amazing young man. Actually, he's not even left school, from the Czech Republic. And despite the Czech Republic not having a lot of coral reefs, he seems to know more about coral reefs than a lot of the so-called experts. This is what Oliver said. Hello, Peter and Leonard. I found a very interesting and scary article. Coral species from another ocean may be the only way to save the Caribbean reefs. I think it's important to make a video about it, he says. It's about a crazy idea to transport the corals from the Indo-Pacific. Now, although scientists are raising awareness about the issue of Indo-Pacific coral transplantation into the Caribbean, they are not focusing on the main cause of the local coral decline there, which is not warming, but disease in the Caribbean region. Although it is true that the reefs in the Indo-Pacific do not suffer from diseases, how do we know that they will not suffer from the same diseases as the native species in the Caribbean? What he's saying is that we could easily transport diseases over to the Caribbean by accident, and this would lead to a real global problem for coral reefs. And he's absolutely right. Now, Oliver also in his email mentions the interesting fact that the corals of the Caribbean were cut off a few million years ago from the rest of the ocean when the Isthmus of Panama closed up. So there's very little flow of genetic material into the Caribbean. So the corals in the Caribbean are very different to what we get over. Well, they're a fair bit different to what we get over in this part of the world. And supposedly the Caribbean reefs are all dying out, badly affected by all sorts of things, including disease. Now, what could possibly go wrong with transplanting plants and animals from one part of the world to another? Now, look at the history of invasive animals around the world. Here in Australia, we've got pigs, rabbits, camels. In the UK, grey squirrels. In Florida, on land, there's the melaleuca from Australia, which has just taken over. And now they want to put corals from over here offshore. It really doesn't sound like a good idea. Now, often this introduction, or usually this introduction of animals is done by accident. An ornamental plant gets out or something like that. But occasionally scientists, just like these ones, have done it for supposedly a good reason. So here in North Queensland, we've got this horrible animal called the cane toad. It was introduced into North Queensland in the 1930s by scientists, and they were going to use it to eliminate cane beetles in the sugarcane fields. And anyway, now those cane toads have spread right around Australia. They kill many native animals because of the poison sac behind their ears. And they doubtless displace many others because they eat the same food. It's been an absolute disaster. Now look, those scientists in the 1930s did this for a good reason. But remember, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So first we need to be sure there's actually a problem over there in the Caribbean, or are we risking making a huge environmental disaster to solve a problem that may not be that serious or doesn't exist at all, while not solving some of the problems over there that do exist? So one of the main problems here is that, do you actually trust the scientific institutions about the fact that the Caribbean corals are in terrible decline from disease or climate or whatever it is? Is the problem not something else like overexploitation or pollution or something like that? Are we sure that these scientists are not barking up the wrong tree in the first place, albeit with the best of intentions? I mean, look at the scientists on the Great Barrier Reef. We've just recorded more coral on the reef in the last 5 years than in any of the previous 35 years since records began. But the scientists are still saying that the Great Barrier Reef is in a disastrous shape. The scientists have shown that they like to tell bad news but not the good news. So they say we've had devastating bleaching on the reef, but we've ended up with record amounts of coral. And the type of coral we've got the most of is the type, the acroporas, which are most susceptible to hot water bleaching. So look, I'm awfully sorry, but I have to say that I need to be convinced that those Caribbean reefs are actually in that bad a shape, bad enough that you want to risk transplantation of corals from a completely different part of the world. And maybe the scientists or the scientific institutions are much more trustworthy over there in America, but if they're like the ones here, I need to be convinced. So let's have a look at a little bit of data. Now, the data for the Caribbean is nowhere near as comprehensive as it is here in Australia, where the Australian Institute of Marine Science has been taking data with exactly the same methods for the best part of 40 years. So this is the data from the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, and I actually used some of this data in a report I did on the world's coral reefs a couple of years ago. So here we see the data. It goes back to 1982, almost to the present. The vertical axis is what we call the coral cover. And it's not really certain that there's a decline at all, I think. Now, let's explain this graph. What does coral cover mean? Think of a coral reef as a little bit like your garden. Some of your garden is covered with grass, some of it is covered with concrete, some with bare earth, weeds, the rose garden or whatever. Well, it's the same with the coral reef. There's lots of the seabed that is covered with coral, which is what we're interested in, hard coral. There's also dead coral or algae or soft coral or coralline algae and various other things. Now, this graph shows the percentage of the seabed that's covered with hard coral since the 1980s. And yes, maybe there's a little bit of a decline, but considering the uncertainty band, that's those green bands, it's not actually obvious that there's a problem. Now, you can read more about this in my report, but I think you can see that, is it really clear that there's a catastrophe unfolding in the Caribbean? It's not obvious that there's a decline at all. Well, that's the data from 1980 to, say, 2019, but now there's new data for the last 5 years for the Caribbean produced by the same organisation, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, and here it is. And the data shows that the coral reef biologists have just invented time travel, gone back to the Caribbean in the 1980s, restored the reefs, occasionally almost doubling the amount of coral on them, which you've got to agree is pretty clever of them. You see, these graphs should be the same from 1980 to about 2019, and then we should have some added data from 2019 to present. But they're not the same for that earlier data, and you've got to wonder why. Now look, it turns out that there's very little actual raw data from before 2000 when the climate change thing got going. And remember, this is a compilation of a lot of reefs in the whole Caribbean, so it has to go back to the raw data. Now, the error bars you can see here are the coloured bands around the solid line. And it turns out that, well, there was obviously very little data back then, and the data was just a survey here and a survey there, usually using totally different methodologies. Now, this is unlike the Great Barrier Reef data, which started in 1985 for the sole purpose of looking at changes and uses very similar methods throughout. That is not the case for the early Caribbean data. So the early Caribbean data is dodgy, and that's why it has huge error bars, but it also means that the scientists can fiddle around with the data and get virtually any number they like with this huge error bar around it. In this case, they do seem to have regenerated coral back in the 1980s, and I knew that they'd been working on coral regeneration, but I had no idea they could do it with time travel. So do you see why I sometimes get just a little bit suspicious about just how bad the Caribbean reefs are and whether climate change of about a degree is really such a huge problem for them? Now, if you ask me the question, can you believe that there could have been a change in the Caribbean, even though the data is not exactly showing something that's completely conclusive? Well, I can. And one of the main reasons is that there's a huge population pressure in the Caribbean. So this graph shows the increase in population. There's about close to 50 million people living within 20 kilometres of a coral reef in the Caribbean. Now, for the Great Barrier Reef, the number of people living within 20 kilometres of the Great Barrier Reef proper, which is mostly 100 kilometres offshore, the total number of people might be a couple of thousand. So, the people pressure on the Caribbean, fishing, pollution, all those things is just way over the top. Now look, if the coral just collapsed like this in a line and it was obviously humans, then I'm not opposed to some sort of intervention. If we've just completely run out of coral in the Caribbean, then why would you not do it? But we want to be sure we have a problem before we play around with things which we do not understand. And these are complicated things. Ecosystems are horribly complicated things. So this is not the only area where scientists are actively contemplating and acting to change nature in ways which we don't understand. So, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, we have a steady stream of news releases from scientists about how they're breeding up these so-called supercorals to be able to deal with heat. Now, fortunately, in those cases, I'm not worried about them because, well, we already have a stream of genetic material from hot water regions which is coming down to the Great Barrier Reef. They're just playing around with what nature is doing naturally anyway. But the Caribbean reefs, well, they're completely different. They're separated. They're separated from the rest of the world, and we must not play God with them. But the scientists are also looking at geoengineering, supposedly to make clouds to shield the reef from the sun to protect it from climate change. Now, I don't think they're going to be allowed to mess around with that. I certainly hope not. But I can see that the scientists might be allowed to introduce feral corals into the Caribbean or just do it on the sly, and that would be utterly stupid. It also shows just how unhinged the science community have become that they would even suggest this sort of thing. It's happened because they live in their own echo chamber where nobody is allowed to ask the simple question, if the data shows no major reduction in the corals, do we really have the problem? Now, of course, part of the issue here is that marine biologists literally love their corals and their turtles, literally love them. And you can hardly blame them because they are stunningly beautiful. But maybe there's a little bit too much emotion and not enough calm scientific logic and data. And also maybe there's just a little bit of vested interest on the part of the scientists. They need a disaster after all, their jobs depend upon it. So have they worked themselves up into a terrible tizzy and stopped listening to the couple of voices who can see that actually, despite there being, no doubt problems in the Caribbean with overfishing and maybe pollution and definitely localized problems, the story is actually a long way from being all doom and gloom if you look at the data. I'm actually going to finish off by quoting from Oliver's emails. He said in his last email, "It seems to me that scientists become so immersed in the scenario of impending doom that they have forgotten about reality and overlook the real danger. Even if their experiments would be successful, how do they know that thousands of corals would not contain any pathogens?" Right, so they might grow all these new corals, but they bring in pathogens. We're already seeing in Caribbean that it only took a few lionfish to fill the Caribbean. So they introduced lionfish somehow into the Caribbean, and now they're in plague proportions. Or that it only took a few colonies of xenia corals to disrupt the reefs in Puerto Rico. Any normal person should be concerned about this. Maybe the acropora in the Caribbean need help from us, restoration. But transplanting non-native corals is the worst idea ever conceived. We are reaching a point when concern about the environment is leading to environmental destruction. I couldn't have put it better myself, and that from a young fella from a place that has no coral reefs who can actually see that this is an absolutely crazy thing that's happening, that our scientists are literally seem to be going crazy.